Dr. Richard Sharpe looked like he had it all. To his patients, he was a top dermatologist. To his neighbours, he was the successful businessman with a perfect wife, home and family. But Richard was also a man full of secrets. When those secrets tore his marriage apart, the respected doctor became known for something much more disturbing. Richard Sharpe was born on the 23rd of August 1954 in Derby, Connecticut. He was one of 4 children, with 2 older brothers and 1 younger sister. When Richard was a child, his family moved to Shelton, as his father was trying to avoid gambling debts which he had built up over a number of years. Richard was both an academically gifted child and also a bit of a troublemaker. He frequently got into fights, which he usually lost, and he seemed to use violence as the answer to everything. Despite these problems, he did well at school. At Shelton High School, Richard met Karen Hatfield. She was 1 year younger, and the couple started somewhat of a forbidden romance. Her parents weren't keen on her having a boyfriend, and they wanted her to focus on her studies. But Richard was nothing if not persistent, and the pair started dating. A few months after Richard and Karen got involved, they found out she was pregnant. Her parents pulled her out of school and organised a private tutor so she could get her diploma. For a while, Karen seemed to go off the idea of staying in a relationship with Richard, and she tried to break up with him on at least 2 separate occasions, but each time he convinced her not to give up on them. Just 3 months after they graduated high school, they got married, against the wishes of both sets of their parents. A few months later, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Shannon. At around the same time, they moved into an apartment of their own. After graduation, Richard enrolled to study mechanical engineering at the University of Connecticut. Karen also trained to become a nurse. When she started working, she used her income to pay for Richard's education. Then, in 1980, Richard decided to change directions, and he enrolled to study medicine with aspirations of becoming a dermatologist. In 1985, the family moved to Boston so Richard could complete his residency at Harvard Medical School. 10 years later, Richard was running a successful dermatology practice and lecturing at Harvard on the side. But he had far greater aspirations, and eventually he founded a company called ClickMed. This was an early attempt to merge healthcare with digital technology. It aimed to create an online platform for medical professionals to access data and information about their specialties. But the internet was still in its infancy, and the platform wasn't as successful as it might have been just a few years later. But the idea of combining technology and health stuck with Richard, and a couple of years later, he founded a chain of laser hair removal clinics called Lays Hair. This time, the business venture was immediately successful, all thanks to the emerging trend of cosmetic dermatology and aesthetic treatments. This company eventually ended up with 18 franchise branches, and it made Richard and Karen millionaires. Over the coming years, they welcomed 2 more children, a son Michael and another daughter Alexandra. By all accounts, Richard Sharpe had it all. Cliché as it seems, he had the perfect family, the beautiful wife, the grand home, and the successful business enterprise. But every one of these cliché situations comes with an equally dark and disturbing side, and that was especially true for Richard. In February 2000, Karen filed for divorce after 27 years of marriage. And the reason? She had discovered Richard had a taste for presenting himself as a woman. It was a secret he had managed to keep hidden from his friends and family for many years, and while Karen had known about it for some time, and it appears to have been the trigger for her decision to leave, it was far from the leading factor. When the divorce documentation was filed with the court, it became a matter of public record, and in that record, Karen detailed years of abuse at the hands of her successful husband, and it went all the way back to the beginning of their marriage. Just 2 weeks after Richard and Karen moved in together, he attacked her with an alarm clock as punishment for not waking up on time. While Richard was a med student, doing a degree that Karen paid for, He locked her inside their home for 48 hours straight. During that time, he repeatedly physically, verbally, and mentally attacked her. When he decided he had enough, he drove her to the hospital to get treatment for her injuries. As they sat in the waiting room, he whispered, quote, "I want you to die," end quote. After that terrifying event, the abuse continued. Richard took complete control over Karen's life, where she went, what she wore, and who she spent time with. He employed her at one of his clinics, which meant he always knew where she was, what she earned, and who she was talking to. Outside of work, Richard was a heavy drinker, and when he drank, he became violent, and he drank often. Karen said that she knew she needed to leave Richard, but she was afraid and ashamed of admitting to her parents that they were right. According to Karen's divorce proceedings, during one particular incident on New Year's Eve, Richard got drunk and beat her. He broke her nose, split her lip, gave her 2 black eyes and a concussion. She was so beaten and bloody that when they tried to check into the hotel they had booked for the night, the clerk refused to let them enter. By the early 1980s, Shannon was nearing 10 years old. That seemed to be the perfect age for her father to start directing his violence at her. Her abuse was also detailed in the divorce proceedings. In one incident, she stated, quote, "He grabbed my neck and continually slammed my head against the wooden bed frame until I could no longer breathe. My next memory is my head hitting the stairs as he dragged me down the flight of stairs, screaming and battering me," end quote. On the 26th of April 1991, Richard came home to find his wife in bed with another man. By then, she had been begging him for a divorce for several years, and she hoped that if he saw her in bed with someone else, he would finally give her what she wanted. But instead, the next morning, he attacked her with a fork and stabbed her in the forehead. She rang the police, and Richard was taken to a mental health institution involuntarily. During this time, he was diagnosed with major depression, with features of anxiety and schizoid or other personality disorder. He was released on medication and returned home after Karen recanted her statement to the police. But this was only because Richard pressured her not to press charges, as it would damage his career as a physician. Back at home, his behaviour did not improve. Instead, he became more violent and unpredictable. In an incident soon after, Richard paraded around the house naked and attacked her brother after a family dinner. In another, he threw a cocktail at a DJ, and the list went on, with Karen and Shannon bearing the brunt of Richard's anger. Karen had known for years that Richard had a taste for women's clothing, but his behaviour had become increasingly erratic in the lead up to the divorce filings. He would get dressed up and go out all night, then return to the house drunk, high on prescription drugs, and violent. Karen became unable to justify staying in the marriage. She filed for divorce to protect herself and her children from the man who had tormented them for decades, and yet this decision would lead directly to her death. Shortly before filing the divorce papers, Karen packed up the 3 children and left the home she had shared with her husband for nearly 30 years. Richard was furious at Karen's decision to leave, and he hired a private investigator to find out where she was staying. He also filed for full custody of their children. Once Karen had spent a few nights in a motel, she moved the children into a second home they owned in Wenham. A short time later, the couple attempted to reconcile their relationship, but that only lasted one night. After that, Karen told Richard it was over for good and they needed to go their separate ways completely. But Richard didn't agree. He began stalking Karen and disrupting things at the home so that she was constantly on edge. Karen responded by filing a restraining order against him, which forbid him from coming near her house. Just before midnight on the 14th of July 2000, Richard turned up on the doorstep of that Wenham home. Karen had just returned from an evening with her friends and was extremely surprised and concerned to see her ex-husband standing there. She told him he was not allowed to be there, due to the restraining order. Richard didn't respond. Instead, he stepped inside the door and raised a hunting rifle into Karen's face. As she turned to run away, he pulled the trigger and shot her once in the back. The bullet exited through her chest, and she bled to death on the floor of her own home. The couple's two youngest children, 7-year-old Michael and 4-year-old Alexandra, were asleep in the next room at the time. So were Karen's brother, his partner, and a babysitter who had been watching the children while Karen was out. Shannon was 26 years old at the time and was not home. While the family rushed to Karen's side and called 911, Richard disappeared into the night. Less than 2 days later, he was found hiding out in a motel in New Hampshire after a tip-off from a motel employee. After a midnight raid, Dr. Richard Sharpe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, possessing a firearm without a license, and violation of a restraining order. During his time on the run, Richard threw the murder weapon away and it has never been recovered. Richard never attempted to deny that he was the one who killed Karen, but he claimed to have been insane at the time. When it came time for court proceedings, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Because he had admitted to being the one who fired the fatal shot at Karen, the facts of the murder itself did not need to be disputed during a trial. Instead, the case in front of the jury was about determining whether Richard was sane at the time of the murder. It was only during court proceedings that the depth of Richard's depravity came to light. Sharon's divorce filing had detailed the physical, verbal, and mental abuse she experienced from her husband. But the murder trial demonstrated that Richard struggled with deep psychological issues that went far beyond his outward behaviour. Cross-dressing and hormone use are valid expressions of identity, and they have no inherent negative implications. But for Richard, these were signs of a much deeper inner conflict. And beyond that, he abused his position as both a doctor and, more concerningly, as a father, to satisfy his personal desires. For years, Richard had been prescribing himself hormones to physically alter his body to become more characteristically feminine. He also used the machines at the laser clinic to remove all of the hair from his body. And ever since Karen had given birth to Sharon, Richard had stolen his wife's birth control for an extra dose of hormones which he hoped would make his breasts grow. But most disturbing of all, he stole underwear from his prepubescent teenager to wear himself. All of that was disturbing, but it didn't prove that he was insane. The prosecution claimed that Richard's motive for killing Karen was threefold. First of all, he didn't want to lose control over her. Secondly, she knew his secret and could expose him at any time. And thirdly, Richard believed she would clean him out during their divorce proceedings. Prosecutors had spoken to friends of Richard who had seen him on the day of the murder, and they testified he was alert and rational at the time. One added that Richard had spoken about buying a gun in the weeks before the murder, and another said he tried to hire someone to ransack Karen's home to freak her out. The lawyers for the prosecution argued that Richard's personal choices around cross-dressing and taking hormones were not enough to indicate he was insane when he killed his wife. Instead, his long history of violence against Karen and their oldest daughter proved he couldn't handle that she wanted to leave him, and he chose to take her life rather than lose control over her. They argued that Richard very clearly knew wrong from right at the time of the shooting, and therefore he was guilty of first-degree murder. The defence case was that Richard was not in control of himself when he shot Karen. They brought in a psychiatric expert who testified that Richard had several mental problems, including major depression, borderline personality disorder, and intermittent explosive disorder. This meant he was not criminally responsible for the shooting. The expert said that Richard's problems were because of an abusive childhood and that he began dressing as a woman as a young teen to avoid his father's insults. Richard's siblings testified in his defence, and they detailed years of abuse at the hands of their father Benjamin. They recalled that Ben was an extremely violent man towards his 3 sons, but he never abused his daughter. Richard was beaten frequently with a baseball bat and chased around the house with a gun. When his older brothers moved out of home, Richard became the only one left for their father to take his anger out on. This made Richard extremely envious of his little sister. He started dressing like her as a young person because it made him feel safe. But then his father found out that he dressed like a woman, which resulted in the worst beating of his life. So he stopped until he was able to cross-dress freely as an adult. The assertions of Richard having a borderline personality disorder are consistent with some aspects of how he presented. He struggled with his own identity as a male and had undergone 4 facial feminization surgeries. He devalued his wife Karen, whilst at the same time being dependent on her for his sense of self. The expert used these factors to indicate Richard must have entered a dissociated state on the night of the murder, and therefore he was unable to determine right from wrong. Richard took to the stand in his own defence, and he claimed that he had a mental illness and had been drinking red wine and taking prescription medication on the night of the murder. According to his testimony, he was driven by a vague compulsion to reunite his family, and yet he also said that's why he turned up at her house with a gun. Make it make sense. He also claimed he had no recollection of the shooting itself, or why he decided to shoot her. Outside of Richard's marriage, he was described by various friends, colleagues, and clients as angry, impulsive, creepy, manipulative, desperate for attention, impolite, and miserable. Some clients also questioned his professionalism, and there were reports that he would ask patients to completely undress when he was examining a small skin lesion on an unrelated part of their body. After 2 weeks of evidence, the jury in Richard's murder trial took 12 hours to deliberate on their verdict. On the 29th of November 2001, Dr. Richard Sharpe was found guilty of first-degree murder and given a sentence of life in prison. After the trial, Shannon moved to New York while her 2 young siblings went to live with their mother's sister, Kathleen. She described Karen as a loving mother, the best sister anybody could have, a wonderful daughter, and a friend. Shannon said that her father was dead to her and to her brother and sister. Quote, "Those kids don't miss him. He was never there for them. They never had any connection with him. I was afraid I would come home and find the 3 of them dead on the front stairs. That was my worst nightmare, that he would do something. And it came true." End quote. Karen's 3 children sued their father for $100 million in damages. The suit was settled for $5 million. Richard's time in jail was no less problematic than his life beforehand. Even before his murder trial got underway, an inmate came forward to say Richard had tried to get him to help him plan an escape from jail. Richard had attempted to bribe the inmate for contacts on the outside and said he was prepared to kill the police if necessary. From jail, he sent his daughter Shannon a Valentine's Day message saying, quote, "Dear Shannon, I loved your mother. I miss her terribly. I cry every day. I want nothing but the best for you, Mike, and Ellie. The only thing that gets me through each day is the thought that my children may need me." End quote. A few months later, he was placed in solitary confinement for making a threatening phone call to Shannon. In March 2002, 4 months after Richard's conviction, he attempted to take his own life. 5 years later, he was accused of conspiring to kill the prosecutor who had led the charge on his conviction. He was later acquitted of these charges. In 2009, Richard's case came to a final conclusion. On the 5th of January 2009, he was found deceased in his cell by his own actions. So much of the reporting on this case has focused on Richard's cross-dressing, like it somehow played a role in Karen's murder. Yes, it made for flashy headlines, but honestly, it's one of the least important parts of the story. What really matters is his history of violence, especially towards his wife and children. There are years of red flags. And yet another story of a wife who ignored what her gut was telling her when she chose to stay. Reports about Karen say that she had low self-esteem and she was eager to please, which made her the perfect target for his psychological attacks. Richard was already dangerous, and when Karen left, He felt like his perfectly curated facade was slipping away. And let's not forget that he abused his position as a doctor to prescribe himself medications which he wasn't being monitored for. These are the real issues, not his choice to cross-dress. Focusing on that just keeps harmful stereotypes alive and makes it seem like people with different interests are dangerous or to be feared. The real danger was in Richard's violence and his unmanaged mental health conditions. That is what killed Karen.